I think it was a wonderful idea that we have a registry of every gun that is owned by a civilian in the United States of America.
Second Amendment. Read it.
That was Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey advocating for a national gun registry. And while it is certainly nothing new to see a Democrat advocate for something that would be considered one of the most un-American things you could advocate for, when it comes to Watson Coleman, there's another layer that makes this a little more interesting, and we'll get to that in a minute. First, here are the full comments by her about the National Gun Registry.
I think it was a wonderful idea that we have a registry of every gun that is owned by a civilian in the United States of America, because then we could have perhaps less killings in our neighborhoods, less killings at our supermarkets, less killings at our concerts, less killings, period, in the United States of America. And when we talk about what the government has no right to tell us whether or not we can have guns, but the government has a right to tell us whether or not we can have a baby. This is absurd, and it is hypocritical, and it is counterproductive. And I think if we had less guns in the hands of people in this country, we'd have a safer community, from the most densely populated poor community to the most affluent. I yield back.
It's truly amazing that anyone would buy into the argument that somehow having a registry would prevent someone from committing a crime. If someone is going to break the law, it's pretty much guaranteed that they don't care whether or not their name is on a list. Aside from her ridiculous statement there, it becomes even more ridiculous when you look into her personal history and her legislative history. The irony and the hypocrisy here is that Watson Coleman, who is promoting a national gun registry, previously sponsored an assembly bill in New Jersey that became law to prevent employers with more than 15 employees from asking job applicants if they have a criminal history. So she believes that the federal government should have a list of every firearm that you own, but an employer should not know if you have previously committed a crime. And this is not just your run-of-the-mill political hypocrisy. If you look further into her history, you'll see that her two sons were convicted and put in prison for holding up a Kids R Us store with a gun. So just to recap this, the congresswoman who wants a national gun registry claiming it would prevent crime, raised two felons convicted of committing a crime with a gun, and has now paid taxpayer dollars to lecture law-abiding citizens about their gun ownership. Then in addition to that, she changed the law in New Jersey to prevent a potential employer from knowing that her sons committed those crimes when they got out of prison. Ultimately, the amendment passed that would prevent the ATF from using these records to create their national gun database. But as you'll see next, they're pretty much already doing it in the first place.
2 weeks ago, Mr. Cloud and I visited the ATF Out of Business Records Processing Center in West Virginia, and I met some very dedicated and amazingly talented people at ATF. But I also saw what they have been directed to do, and so I'm introducing this amendment to bring the ATF into compliance with the law as it is written and passed by Congress in 1986, called the Firearms Owners Protection Act, which is now 18 U.S.C. 926 Alpha 3. The law required out-of-business federal firearms licensees to transfer to ATF all their records less than 20 years old. Hence, the Out-of-Business Records Division at ATF was established. Well, that same law that requires out-of-business FFLs to send those records to ATF also prohibits the government from recording those records. The law, as now recorded in 18 U.S.C. 926 Alpha 3, says, no such rule or regulation prescribed after the date of the enactment of the Firearms Owners Protection Act may require that records required to be maintained under this chapter or any portion of the contents of such records be recorded at or transferred to a facility owned, managed, or controlled by the United States or any state or political subdivision. That's part one. Nor that any system of registration of firearms, firearm owners, or firearm transactions be established. That's part two. And that's current law. This prohibition was supposed to prevent the recording of these records, in part or in whole, at any government facility, and to prevent the records from being recorded at a private facility and then being transferred to the government. The law covered all bases. In 2021, Rep. Cloud inquired in a letter to the ATF, and in their response dated February of 2022, they acknowledged that they have recorded in digital format almost 900 million records. And they are on their way to 1 billion firearm transaction records from out-of-business federal firearms licensees. So this law prohibits ATF from recording transactions or any part of them and from using those records to establish a registration database. That is a two-part prohibition. Now, ATF claims that because their database is not a name-searchable database, that they're not creating a registry. But I think that actually is irrelevant, as the first part prohibited the recording of paper transaction records, and they are now doing that with high-speed scanners. I cannot see how this is not a violation of the law. Why do they need scanners and scanner maintenance if they are not using them to record documents? The ATF is not above the law, and we must ensure that they are not operating outside the law. While out-of-business federal firearms licensees are required to turn in their records to ATF, the ATF is not permitted to record these records. Yet in 2022, the ATF spent almost $10.2 million to receive, digitize, and store out-of-business records. In 2023, the estimate was almost $10.3 million. The language of the law is very clear to me. The law allows them to keep the records and to organize the records and to inquire into the records, but it does not allow them to record the records or any part of the records in any way. By their own admission, ATF is recording these records in digital form. This digitizing, especially now with the advent of artificial intelligence, represents the foundation of a national gun database, which is, again, unlawful and incredibly dangerous. Country after country across the world has proven that gun registration eventually leads to gun confiscation. England, Australia, Germany, New Zealand, Canada, and the list goes on. I urge my colleagues on this committee to support this crucial amendment that preserves our Second Amendment liberties by ensuring that ATF follows the letter of the law.
As has been mentioned, Title 18, Section 926 of the U.S. Code prohibits the federal government from maintaining such a federal gun registry. And our research has led us to find that virtually a billion gun records are now being stored in a digital database at the ATF. What has been especially concerning has been the ATF's recent efforts to enlarge this database. What's supposed to happen is when an FFL goes out of business, the records get stored there. They're stored for 20 years, and then they were supposed to be disposed of. Well, the Biden administration says now we're going to keep those indefinitely, and then has also instituted a zero tolerance policy against FFLs to essentially push them out of business in an effort to grow the database. This is very troubling and something that people who are very concerned about their Second Amendment rights are very concerned about, and we should support this amendment to make sure that this practice has not. I will say also, in my efforts to communicate with ATF on this issue, we have asked for information on traces that lead to prosecutions. They are not able to provide that sort of information. I am still trying to drill down on this. I have a couple more amendments coming up that will introduce some report language to help us get more information on this. But in the meantime, I do support this amendment.
The gentleman from Georgia and the gentleman from Texas have it exactly right. What this amendment does is this stops the federal government from making a registry of firearms. And it's a technology registry. Because to say that, well, you know, we can't do traces if we don't have this is ridiculous, because we've done traces for decades. The records go to ATF, and when a law enforcement agency calls in, they go to that file and they manually look through it to see where that firearm was transferred, to whom it was transferred. But in an attempt to create a registry, the ATF uses technology now. It scans the records. And you all know that once it scans the records, your name is in a digital database somewhere. Now, they can say, well, this just speeds up the process. This just allows us to go into this digital database, and it makes it a little faster. But what it also does, it creates a computer somewhere with every firearm transfer in the nation where that record has been sent to the ATF. And if anybody here doesn't believe that in 1 hour, a relatively low-level computer person could design a program that puts John Doe with a certain birthday in, and it spits out all the firearms that John Doe with that birthday has. That's a registry. And many of you know my parents came from countries that were communist. That's the way the communists did it. They created registries of everything you had. And then when they wanted to go after you, they knew whether you had a firearm. They knew whether you had a rifle because you were a hazard to the state. And they confiscated it, or worse. Look, that Second Amendment is pesky to some people. We could eliminate all firearm crimes if we just eliminated every single firearm in the country, but we have that pesky Second Amendment. And that Second Amendment is here to protect your rights as a citizen, your right to keep and bear arms. The federal government has no business creating a registry in any form of the firearms you possess, because that right wasn't given to you by the federal government. That right was God-given. That's the way our government is based. Our rights are not given to us by the federal government, but this federal government is attempting to take away our rights. The gentleman's amendment is right on target. Pardon the expression. We cannot allow a registry to be created in the United States. The ATF is doing it, and this is an appropriate place to put a stop to it. I yield back.
You know, my amendment is simply the defunding of what I see as a violation of the law. It simply restates the existing law, and the law is very clear. How can we say that it's okay to record when the law specifically says no such rule or regulation prescribed after the date of the Firearms Owners Protection Act may require that records be recorded at or transferred to a United States facility? I mean, this is really clear, and it's very clear that when you photocopy something or that when you digitize something, you are recording it. And when you record it, you're violating 18 U.S.C. 926. So with that, I ask all members to support this amendment.
Hi, I've got a quick question about the hiring process.
Okay.
So whenever I'm so say down the road, whenever I decide to apply to the ATF for an internship or something, am I required to not know the Second Amendment, or am I trained to ignore it?
Everyone, as always, any requirements for internships or employment will be listed